Hi, hello, and welcome to our very first video lecture of this course. We're going to begin our U.S. history course with a unit on the American Revolution, and part one of the reading that you have already completed focused on the English colonization of North America. So that's going to be the focus of our lesson today is colonization and colonial society, what colonial society was like. All right, so to start out this lecture, let's just quickly preview the main ideas. What are the three big takeaways that I want you to get out of this lecture? The very first one is that European countries colonized America and competed with each other for power. You have Great Britain had colonized the parts of North America. You had the French, the Spanish, and Russia, and these four countries had competed against each other for power in the region. The second big idea that I want you to take away is that slavery had defined the colonization of the Americas and the Caribbean. And we still feel the ripple effects of slavery even to this day. Number three, England pursued a mercantilist policy designed to increase the wealth and power of England through colonization and trade. If this word right here threw you off, you don't really understand what mercantilism is, don't worry, we'll get to it by the end of this lecture. All right, so I'd like to start out this lecture with a map, how things look in 1776. And 1776 was the year in which the 13 colonies had declared their independence from Great Britain. So those 13 colonies I had highlighted here in yellow. This proclamation line of 1763, we'll talk about that in later lectures. But what I really want you to remember is just the 13 colonies were along the eastern coast of the present day United States. So some essential vocabulary for you in this lecture. The word colony, you should know what the word colony means. So if we're talking about England or Great Britain, we'll talk about the difference between the two in class. But if we're talking about England, Great Britain, colonizing the parts of the eastern seaboard of the United States, you should probably understand what a colony is. So a colony is a country or a region. In this case, it's a region because South Carolina, Virginia, New York, they were not their own countries. So we're talking about a region that is under full or partial political control of another country, in this case, England, Great Britain. Typically a distant one, and occupied by settlers of that country. So the word legislator is also a word that I want you to know. And legislator is the body of a country or state that has the power to make laws. So our national legislator in the United States is our U.S. Congress. The legislator in Illinois is the Illinois General Assembly. Whatever body is or collection of people that are empowered to make laws, that's what is known as a legislator. And then lastly, this word right here. This isms and ologies are always very difficult for students. So mercantilism, what is that? I'm going to give you concrete examples later on in the lecture, but let's at least define it right now. Mercantilism is an economic system that encourages trade to center around the mother country. The mother country, so in our lecture, we're talking about England. The mother country establishes colonies and requires those colonies to sell raw materials, something I'll define on the next slide, to it so that it can manufacture goods which it sells back to the colonies. The purpose is to maintain a favorable balance of trade, minimizing imports or things that they bring into their country, and then maximizing exports, things that they sell to other countries. Okay, so when we're talking about raw materials here. Raw materials are basic materials from which a manufactured product is made. So let's keep it simple here. Let's talk about a pencil. A pencil is a manufactured product, meaning that somebody has to make that pencil. Pencils don't just fall off trees looking like that. So it has to be made. So, what are the basic raw materials that go into a pencil? Well, you have wood, you have graphite. A lot of people think it's lead. It's not lead, it's graphite. You have rubber, the eraser. And then you also have the metal piece that connects the wood to the rubber. So those are considered the raw materials, the basic materials that are eventually manufactured into a product. And then lastly, I want to define militia. A militia is a military force, kind of this paramilitary force that is raised from the civilian population. So it's not the official military. Rather, militias are civilians that take up arms, usually to either supplement a military, but more often to prepare to fight in case the military turns on them or something. So militias were organized in the colonial era in order to fight against the British Army. But we'll get there. All right, so let's start out. The very first question that I ask you here is who lived in the colonies? So let's discuss who actually was occupying this area during the pre-revolutionary period. Well, this goes back 10,000 actually more than 10,000 years, because if it's 10,000 BCE and we're currently in 2020, we're talking about 12,020 years ago, you had native peoples arriving in North America. So, and this is why there's this controversy around Columbus Day, because did Columbus really discover America? Well, Columbus was the first European to discover that there was a continent on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. By the way, let's talk about Columbus here for a second. Columbus never actually landed in the mainland United States. A lot of people think that he had landed in like Florida, modern day Virginia, or somewhere on the East Coast, and he didn't. Columbus actually landed over here in the modern day Bahamas. He thought that he was in India, which is why he termed the people, he kind of labeled the people Indians. And I guess that is an understandable mistake if he actually thought that he was in India. But then Europeans, when they eventually figured out that they had discovered this new world, they kept calling the native peoples Indians, which and that's why in the 1900s you have many native tribes tried to shed that term of Indian, saying that we're not Indians. India is a country on the other side of the world. And so they started referring to themselves as Native Americans, which is also problematic because North America and South America was labeled America after Amerigo Vespucci, who was a European sailor that ended up navigating the coasts and really mapping this new territory. Well, here, once again, if you're saying a Native American, you're still using a European contrived term in order to define many different thousands of native nations. And so that's also problematic as well. However, today you have many different Native American tribes tend to accept the term Native American because even though they had unique experiences in the past, their treatments by the U.S. governments over the past like 250 years has been fairly similar. So that's why the term Native American is a more accepted term. But if you really want to label native groups by probably the most correct name, you would just refer to them as native peoples or native tribes to emphasize that there were thousands of unique nations. All right, so these native peoples had arrived in North America around 10,000 BCE. So this is 10,000 years before the year zero. So where did the native peoples come from? Well, they came from Asia. You have a theory right now, and there is some evidence to back this up, but it is still a theory that they had come from Asia along the Bering Strait. So here, this is a map that depicts the route that would have been taken by native peoples by land and along the coast. Here, anything that's in brown is additional land that used to be there, at least on the surface, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 years ago, but is now underwater. Over time, you have glaciers end up melting and the sea levels rise, which ended up sinking this land here. But the theory is that Asia is so close to present-day Alaska that native peoples probably traveled along this route all the way down into modern day United States and then kind of dispersed around the region over the course of thousands of years. So, uh, native peoples built cities, developed intricate cultures and religions, and were very advanced. And take the in Illinois, you have Cahokia. It was a native civilization, and you can actually still go to Cahokia today, and you can see these gigantic mounds that were built for. You have people think that they not only would have served as town squares, but also for religious purposes as well. I've never been to Cahokia, but that's something that would be on my bucket list, something that I want to see soon. So European countries colonized North America. Here we're talking in Columbus sailed the blue in 1492. So European countries colonized North America and then established settlements and competed for power with each other. Also, we should consider the experiences of enslaved Africans who struggled for their own freedom in the pre revolutionary period, and native peoples who fought to preserve the land that they had lived on for thousands of years. People were already living here, but the Europeans had kind of staked their claim over the eastern seaboard and weren't all that interested in sharing the land with the people that were already living there. All right, so the first colonists came from the country of England. Some left England with the aim of creating a new society, but brought with them some old ideas. Take the Puritans. The Puritans had left in about 1620, and you probably have heard of the legend of Plymouth Rock, where you had the Puritans left England because they feared religious persecution. They were fearing that they were going to be jailed or killed because they had a religion that differed from the Church of England. Well, they traveled to the United States. They landed in modern day Massachusetts, and the legend goes that the first rock that they had set foot on in this new world was Plymouth Rock. Um, and Plymouth Rock, it's not all that large. I mean, it's actually pretty tiny. If you were to ever go to Massachusetts, you can see there's a kind of a monument that's built over Plymouth Rock, and it is a boulder, but it's not a huge boulder. It's probably the size of, I don't know, the desk that I'm currently sitting at right now. It's very underwhelming. So, anyways, the Puritans and the English that had come here from England had brought with them some old ideas from England, and one of those ideas is that they judge people's worth and value based on their race. And I guess this is a good time to stop and pause for a second to talk about the idea of race. There, scientifically speaking, biologically speaking, there really is no thing as race. we all belong to the same species. We are all Homo sapiens. So why do we have in our mind this idea of different races? Well, I'm going to hand it over to Bill Nye. He'll explain.
This is a map of the continents of the Earth showing how much ultraviolet light lands in each latitude. It turns out the closer you are to the equator, the more intense the ultraviolet. We use reds and purples. But then as you move away from the equator, we change the colors to orange, yellow, greens, and grays. Now here's the same map of the same continent with just one color. And it turns out that everybody on Earth is descended from people that live here in Africa. And then as groups of us moved around the world, the color of our skin had to change. And here's why. Our skin is where we make vitamin D. If you don't get enough ultraviolet, you don't get enough vitamin D. But if you get too much ultraviolet, then you break down your folates. You have to have it in perfect balance. And because the ultraviolet varies, the color of our skin varies. And that's it, everybody. That's why we have different colored skin. But we're all one species. But we're not treating each other fairly. Not everybody's getting an even shake. So it's time to change things.
All right, so there you go. I mean, that's biologically and scientifically speaking, there really is no such thing as race. This is a social construction, meaning that humans are the ones that created this idea of race. Because, and then you have the English here when they're bringing these ideas to the new world that, oh, because you have darker skin than I do, you must be less valuable or uncivilized. And this, you can see that the groundwork is being laid for the racialized society that we still to this day live in. Now, they had used this idea of racial inferiority of Africans and native peoples to justify the enslavement of and violence towards those people, other races. So let's talk about this word enslavement here for a second. I'm going to be using throughout this entire course the phrase enslaved person rather than slave. And I will be using the term enslaver instead of the term master or owner. And this is why. Today's terminology, today most historians speak of enslaved people instead of slaves. This language separates a person's identity from his or her circumstance. I am a teacher because I chose to be a teacher. It is something that is part of my identity, but it is not something that happened to me. It's not something that is just circumstance, something that was imposed upon me. But slavery is. So nobody chose to be a slave. This is why you use the term enslaved person or enslaved African. Here, enslaver versus owner or master, the usage of owner or master empowers the enslaver and dehumanizes the enslaved person, reducing him or her to a commodity or like something that can be traded, kind of like property, rather than a person who has had slavery imposed upon him or her. So just a couple notes on terminology that I'm going to be using in this course and that I would encourage you to be using as well. So the English had really divided colonial society along racial lines. When the English colonists arrived, they faced a significant labor shortage, and this is why they had turned to slavery. That you had many colonists that formed plantations in the New World. They wanted cheap labor to work the fields. So to solve this, they captured and enslaved native peoples. But when war and disease resulted in fewer natives, colonists began importing or like bringing to the colonies enslaved Africans in 1619. So this idea of war and disease decimating native populations, some historians estimate that upwards towards 95% of certain native nations were killed by either war or disease that was brought to the New World by Europeans. So according to colonial laws, an enslaved person was both a person and property owned by another person. So it was kind of a dual identity. It was part person, part property. Later on in history, uh, enslaved persons were viewed as less of a person and more just property that can be bought and sold. And we'll get there not in our next unit. Actually, yeah, no, in our next unit on westward expansion, the growth of the nation. It's really going to set the stage for our third unit on the Civil War. So there's a clear distinction that arose between white Europeans and black Africans at this time. So enslaved Africans found ways to resist slavery. Many had worked slowly as a subtle way of resisting. Others had chosen to run away from their enslaver, or uh, others had committed arson, meaning that they would burn down the houses of their enslavers. And a few had resorted to violence to escape their situation. Slavery really came to define this colonial period in the Americas and furthermore in the Caribbean. It wasn't just a North American phenomenon. This was not just uh, something that affected the United States. This is something that had infected the Caribbean. This has infected Brazil and South America. And so slavery defined the colonization of the Western Hemisphere. Before 1800, 10 million people had crossed the Atlantic Ocean, 8.5 million of which were enslaved Africans. That's 85% of all people that were crossing the Atlantic Ocean were enslaved persons from Africa, many of which did not survive the journey. So here you have a diagram of what a slave ship would have looked like. And you have all of these enslaved Africans that would be um, placed side by side. They would lay down. You really didn't have more than like 10 inches of room to move around in the slave ships. And sometimes when you had disease, it's had affected one or two people, it would quickly spread uh, among the ship. And that's part of the reason why so many Africans were placed on these ships, because it was kind of the English viewed it as a numbers game. They kind of assumed that many of the Africans would die during the trip, and so the English wanted to fit as many enslaved Africans onto a ship as they could, so that they can get as many Africans to the New World to work the fields. How did European colonists and native societies affect one another? So we're going to shift our mindset from the interaction between the English and Africans to the English colonists and the natives. So native peoples and colonists sometimes enjoyed peaceful relations, but political, religious, and economic differences often led to misunderstandings and sometimes violence. And once again, I want to underscore the point that there are thousands of different native nations that were existing at this time, and every one of these nations had different relationships with the European colonists. So I don't want you to think that, oh, just one native experience can be generalized for all native groups. That's not the case. Okay, so some native groups got along with the colonists. Other native groups very much went to war with the colonists. So the colonists exposed the native people to diseases that wiped out anywhere from 60 to 90% of natives. I had mentioned the 95% figure earlier. That was the upper estimate by historians, but the lower estimates that were given were 60%. So historians say that disease had wiped out at minimum 60% of almost all native nations. Natives and colonists viewed land differently, and this was a huge problem during the colonial era. Natives had ties to land for cultural, spiritual, and economic reasons. Europeans, however, insisted on owning land and believed that it could be bought, sold, stolen, or signed over in treaties. And so the European view of land is that it was something that it was property, that it was personal property, something that a person can own. But the natives didn't view the land that way. They viewed the land as something that had provided them with the resources they need to survive. But they didn't, most native groups weren't under the impression that they owned the land, but rather that they would take care of the land that their ancestors had lived on for many, many years, and the land would take care of them. Competing claims to land often led to violence. Up to 25% of native populations died in these wars with colonists. So, how did European colonists and native societies affect one another? The colonists' desire for land and the devastating effects of disease and war had forced the native peoples from the eastern seaboard. And by 1715, the population of native people living on coastal regions of Virginia, that's what VA is here, had decreased from many thousands to around 500. So you can see that on the whole, colonists, certainly in Virginia, were pushing back native peoples further west into the continent. How were the colonies governed? So now we're talking about government here. What was the structure of colonial government? Well, England formed colonies for the purposes of trade, exploration, and settlement. So all 13 colonies held unique charters that defined the relationship between the colonists and the royal governments in England. So this charter was kind of like a contract saying this is the relationship here, that the colonies are given permission to exist by the royal government of England. However, when it comes down to it, they still answer to the king. They are subjects of the king. So by 1720, each colony had a governor to represent the king in the New World, a council, and an elected assembly. And so I have an image here. You have the top of all governments was the British Crown, and then underneath the king is the royal governor. You would have had 13 of these royal governors, one for each colony. And then the royal governor would have a council that would be appointed by the governor and acted as the highest court in each one of the colonies, and a colonial assembly. And these would be elected by eligible colonists. Those eligible colonists were elite white landowners, white male landowners. So a very, very small portion of society. But the colonial assembly made laws, had the authority to tax the colonists, and paid the governor's salary. Let's jump into mercantilism. I defined it earlier, but let's give you some concrete examples of how this had worked in the 13 colonies. So the rulers of England believed that the colonies had existed to strengthen the mother country and pursued this mercantilist policy. So if you look over at this cartoon, you have the mother country. Here would be England. And then all of the colonies of England would be delivering gold and silver, so these precious metals, foodstuffs, so agricultural goods, and other raw materials, lumber, iron, rubber, things like that. So it was all meant to feed the mother country. It was all designed to strengthen England. So the colonies sent raw materials, usually harvested by enslaved Africans or indentured servants. What an indentured servant is, and I had a couple of you reach out to me and ask what an indentured servant is. An indenture is a contract that was signed by poor Europeans that couldn't afford the trip across the Atlantic Ocean to the colonies. And so you had landowners in the 13 colonies would make poor Europeans sign this contract and say, we'll pay for your ticket to the colonies, but you, in order to pay off your debt to us, need to work for us on our land for a specified period of time. And so that contract was called an indenture, and people that agreed to that contract were indentured servants. So after the colonies sent the raw materials to England, English factories turned those raw materials into manufactured goods and then sold those manufactured goods back to the colonies and also to other European countries at a very large profit. So you think about it, England is getting all of these raw materials that essentially for free because they're using enslaved African labor and also the labor of indentured servants. And then they're taking all of these free raw materials, building stuff, and then selling those goods back to the colonists and also to other European countries. So this was very, very profitable to England. And you can see this comic here. You have the giant mother country, and this guy here says, even though the pay stinks, we should only trade with the mother country. It's for our own good. And the guy down here says, but do you see how much more this guy is paying? And they represent the colonies. This is foreign market. So this guy looks like I don't know, let's say he's from Spain. And this guy from Spain saying, we'll give you a ton of money if you give us those raw materials. But nope, because of mercantilism, the colonies had to give those raw materials to the mother country. And then the mother country would end up putting them through their factories, and then it would spit out manufactured goods, and it would sell it back to the colonies. And so you see this guy looks really sad as he's handing over a bag of money to the mother country. So in times of war, England used ships built in the colonies, drafted colonial sailors to serve in the English Navy, and enlisted colonial militias to fight in North America. So you can see they were really trying to exploit the colonists. They considered the colonists as just simply be an extension of Britain. So very much you belong to us and you're going to serve us. And here, also to show you mercantilism, this is what's known as triangular trade. You have raw materials being sent to England, British goods would be developed, sent to the colonies, sent to Africa. The British would enslave Africans and then ship them to the 13 colonies. So you can see it's formed a triangle across the Atlantic Ocean. So mercantilism, I should put an M there, also drove up demand for enslaved labor and created tensions between the colonists and native peoples who also depended on North American land. And so this mercantilist mindset where Britain wants more and more and more, and they want raw materials at the cheapest possible price. They view enslaved Africans as the cheapest way to get those raw materials. That you don't have to pay workers if you are enlisting enslaved labor. And as more and more enslaved labor came to the 13 colonies, you really saw slavery expanding westward. You had bigger and bigger plantations that were being developed and encroaching on native land. And so here you have an image that shows the percentage of the total population that was enslaved peoples. Here it's a slave population, say enslaved population. But the colonies, you have the colony of Georgia, for example, 45% of all people living in Georgia were enslaved persons. South Carolina, 61% of all people living in South Carolina were enslaved, and so on and so forth. So I know this was a fairly long lecture, but let me go ahead and just summarize the big points so that you know the main ideas that I want you taken away from this lecture. One, European countries colonized America and competed for power. The 13 colonies were colonized by the English or British. Number two, slavery defined the colonization of the Americas and the Caribbean. We are going to continue talking about the institution of slavery for the next several units. And then number three, England pursued a mercantilist policy designed to increase the wealth and the power of England through colonization and trade. All right, that's it for today. I hope you learned something. Until next time.